Chapter 2. A Secret Kept. Because of that singular reply, Madeline found faith to go further with the cowboy. But at the moment, she really did not think about what he had said. Any answer to her would have served if it had been kind. His silence had augmented her nervousness, compelled her to voice her fear. Still, even if she had not replied at all, she would have gone on with him. She shuddered at the idea of returning to the station where she believed there had been a murder. She couldn't have forced herself to go back to those dim lights in the street. She did not want to be wandering alone in the dark. And as she walked on into the darkness, much relieved that he had answered as he had, reflecting that he had yet to prove his words true, she began to grasp the deeper significance to them. There was a revival of pride that made her feel that she ought to scorn to think at all about such a man. But Madeline Hammond discovered that the thought was involuntary, that there were feelings in her never dreamed of before this night. Presently, Madeline's guide turned off the walk and rapped at a door of a low-roofed house. "Hello, who's there?" A deep voice answered. "Gene Stewart," said the cowboy. "Call Florence, and quick." Thumps of footsteps followed, a tap on a door, and voices. Madeline heard a woman exclaim, "Gene, here when there's a dance at night. Something's wrong out at the range." A light flared up and shone through a window. In another moment, there was a soft pattering of steps, and the door opened to disclose a woman holding a lamp.
"Gene, Al's not..."
"Al's all right," interrupted the cowboy. Madeline had two sensations then, one of wonder at the note of alarm and love in the woman's voice, and the other of unutterable relief to be safe with a friend of her brother's. "This is Al's sister. Came on tonight's train," the cowboy was saying. "I happened to be at the station, and I fetched her up to you." Madeline came forward out of the shadow.
"It can't be Her Majesty Hammond!"
exclaimed Florence Kingsley. She nearly dropped the lamp, and she looked and looked, astonished beyond belief.
"Yes, it's me," said Madeline. "My train was late, and for some reason Alfred did not meet me. Mr. Stewart saw fit to bring me to you instead of taking me to the hotel." "Oh, I'm so glad to meet you," replied Florence warmly. "Do come in. I'm so surprised. I forgot my manners. Why, Al never mentioned you were coming."
"Perhaps he hadn't received my messages," said Madeline as she entered. The cowboy who came in with her satchel had to stoop to enter the door, and once in, he seemed to fill the room. Florence set the lamp down upon the table. Madeline saw a young woman with a smiling, friendly face and a profusion of hair hanging down over her dressing gown.
"Oh, but Al will be so glad," cried Florence. "Why, you're white as a sheet. You must be tired. What a long wait you had at the station. I heard the train come in hours ago as I was going to bed. That station is lonely at night. If I had known you were coming... Oh, you're so pale. Are you ill?" "No, I'm just very tired. Traveling so far by rail is harder than I imagined. I did have, however, a long wait arriving at the station, but I can't say that it was lonely."
Florence Kingsley searched Madeline's face with keen eyes, and then took a long, significant look at that silent Stewart. With that, she deliberately and quietly closed the door leading into another room.
"Miss Hammond, what happened?"
She lowered her voice.
"I do not wish to recall it at all that had happened," replied Madeline. "I shall tell Alfred, however, that I'd rather met a hostile Apache than a cowboy." "Don't tell Al that," cried Florence.
And then she grasped Stewart and pulled him close to the light.
"Gene, you're drunk."
"I am pretty drunk," he replied, hanging his head.
"Oh, what have you done?"
"Now, see here, Flo, I only..."
"I don't want to know." "I'd tell it, Gene. Don't you ever want to learn about decency? Aren't you ever going to stop drinking? You'll lose all your friends. Still, we'll have stuck to you. Al's been your best friend. Molly and I have pleaded with you, and now you've gone and done God knows what."
"What do women want to wear veils for?" he growled. "I'd have known her but for that veil."
"And you wouldn't have insulted her, but you would have the next girl that come along. Jean, you're hopeless. Now you get out of here and don't ever come back."
"Flo," he entreated.
"I mean it."
"I reckon then I'll come back tomorrow and take my medicine," he replied.
"Don't you dare!"
she cried. Stuart went out and closed the door.
"Miss Hammond, you don't know how this hurts me," says Florence. "What you must think of us. It's so unlucky that you should have had that happen right at first. Now maybe you wouldn't have the heart to say, 'Oh, I've known more than one Eastern girl to go home without ever learning what we're really like out here.' Miss Hammond, Gene Stewart is a fiend when he's drunk. All the same, I know. Whatever he did, he meant no shame to you. Come now, don't think about it tonight."
She took up the lamp and led Madeline into a little room.
"This out west,"
she went on, smiling as she indicated a few furnishings.
"But you can rest. You're perfectly safe. Wouldn't you let me help you undress? Can't I do anything for you?" "You're very kind, thank you, but I can manage," replied Madeline. "Well then, good night. The sooner I go, the sooner you'll rest. Just forget what happened and think how fine a surprise you're going to give your brother tomorrow."
With that, she slipped out and softly shut the door. As Madeline laid her watch on the bureau, she noted that the time was past 2 o'clock. It seemed long since she had gotten off the train. When she turned out the lamp and crept wearily into bed, she knew she was utterly spent. She was too tired to move a finger, but her brain whirled. She had at first no control over it, and 1,000 sensations came and went, and reoccurred with little logical relation. There were the roar of train, the feeling of being lost, the sound of pounding hooves, a picture of her brother's face as she had last seen it 5 years before, a long dim line of lights, the jingle of silver spurs, night, wind, darkness, and stars. And then the gloomy station, the shadowy blanketed Mexican, the empty room, the dim lights across the square, the tramp of the dancers, and vacant laughs and music. The door flung wide in the entrance of the cowboy. She did not recall how he had looked or what he had done. In the next instant she saw him cool, smiling devilish, saw him in violence. The next his bigness, his apparel, his physical being was vague as outlines in a dream. The white face of the padre flashed along the train of thoughts, and it brought the same dull, half-blind, indefinable state of mind to the last nerve-breaking pistol shot. That passed, and then the clear and vivid rose memories of the rest that had happened. Strange voices betraying fury of men, a deadened report, the moan of mortal pain, and a woman's cry. Madeline saw the girl's great tragic eyes and the wild flight of the big horse in the darkness, the dark stalking figure of the silent cowboy, and the white stars that seemed to look down remorselessly. This tide of memory rolled over Madeline again and again, gradually losing its power and fading. All distress left her, and she felt herself drifting. How black the room was, as black with her eyes open as it was when they were shut. And the silence, it was like a cloak. There was absolutely no sound. She was in another world from that which she knew. She thought of that fair-haired Florence and of Alfred, and wondered about them, and she dropped to sleep. When she awoke in the morning, the room was bright with sunlight. A cool wind blowing across the bed caused her to put her hands under the blanket. She was lazing and dreaming about the mud walls of this little room when she remembered where she was and how she'd come there. How great a shock she'd been subject to, in a sensation of disgust that overwhelmed her. She even shut her eyes to try and blot out the recollection. She felt she'd been contaminated. Presently, Madeline Hammond again woke to the fact that she had learned the preceding night, that there were emotions to which she had, wherefore been a stranger. She did not try to analyze him, but she exercised her self-control to such good purpose that by the time she had dressed, she was outwardly her usual self. She scarcely remembered when she had found it necessary to control her emotions. There had been no trouble, no excitement, no unpleasantness in her life. It had been ordered for her, tranquil, luxurious, brilliant, varied, yet always the same. She was not surprised to find the hour late, and was going to make inquiry about her brother when a voice arrested her. She recognized Miss Kingsley's voice addressing someone outside, and it had a sharpness she had not noted before.
"So you've come back, did you? Well, you don't look very proud of yourself this morning, Jean Stewart. You look like a coyote."
"Well, Flo, if I'm a coyote, I'm not going to be sneaking," he said.
"What'd you come for?"
she demanded. "I said I was coming round to take my medicine."
"Meaning you'll not run from Al Hammond? Jean, your skull is as thick as an old cow. Al will never know anything about what you did to his sister unless you tell him. And if you do that, he'll shoot you. So she won't give you away. She's a thoroughbred. Why, she was so white last night I thought she'd drop at my feet. But she never blinked an eyelash. I'm a woman, Jean Stewart, and if I could feel like Miss Hammond, I know how awful an ordeal she must have had. Why, she's one of the most beautiful, most sought after, the most exclusive women in New York City. There's a crowd of millionaires and dukes and lords after her. How terrible it'd be for a woman like her to be kissed by a drunken cowboy. I say it."
"Flo, I never insulted her that way," broke out Stewart.
"It's worse then, was it?"
she inquired sharply. "I made a bet that I'd marry the first girl who come to town. I was on the watch and pretty drunk, and when she came, well, I got the Padre Marco and tried to bully her into marrying me."
"Oh, Lord!" Florence gasped. "It's worse than I feared. Jean, Al will kill you."
"Well, that'll be a good thing," replied the cowboy.
"Jean Stewart, it certainly would be, unless you turn over a new leaf," retorted Florence. "But don't you be a fool."
And here she became earnest and appealing.
"Go away, Jean. Go join the rebels across the border. You're always threatening that. Anyhow, don't stay here and run any chance of stirring Al up. He'll kill you just the same as you'd kill another man for insulting your sister. Don't make trouble for Al. It'll be only sorrow for her, Jean."
The subtle import was not lost upon Madeline. She was distressed because she could not avoid hearing what was meant not for her ears. She made an effort not to listen, but it was futile. "Flo, you can't see this a man's way," he replied quietly. "I'll stay and I'll take my medicine."
"Jean, I could swear at you or any other pig-headed cowboy. Listen, my brother-in-law Jack heard something of what I said to you last night, and he doesn't like you. I'm afraid he'll tell Al. For heaven's sakes, man, go downtown and shut him up and yourself too."
And then Madeline heard her come into the house and presently rap on the door and call softly.
"Miss Hammond, are you awake?" "Awake and dressed, Miss Kingsley. Come in." "Oh, you've rested. You look so different, I'm sure. Come on out now. We'll have breakfast, and then you may expect your brother any moment." "Wait, please. I was hearing you speak to Mr. Stewart. It was unavoidable, but I am glad. I must see him. Will you please ask him to come into the parlor a moment?" "Yes,"
replied Florence quickly, and as she turned to the door, she flashed at Madeline a woman's meaning glance.
"You make him keep his mouth shut."
Presently there were slow, reluctant steps outside the front door, then a pause and the door opened. Stewart stood, bareheaded, in the sunlight. Madeline remembered with a kind of a shudder the tall form, the embroidered buckskin vest, the red scarf, the bright leather wristbands, the wide silver belt-buckled chaps and belt. Her glance seemed to run over him swift as lightning. but as she saw his face now, she did not recognize it. The man's presence aroused in her a revolt, yet something in her, the incomprehensible side of her nature, thrilled at the look of the splendid dark-faced barbarian.
"Mr. Stewart, will you please come in?" she asked after that long pause.
"I reckon not," he said. The hopelessness of his tone meant that he knew he was not fit to enter a room with her, nor did he care much for the idea. Madeline went to the door. The man's face was hard, yet it was sad too, and it touched her.
"I'll not bring my brother into this, your rudeness to me," she began.
It was impossible for her to keep the chill out of her voice, to speak with other than pride and aloofness of her class. Nevertheless, despite her loathing, when she had spoken so far, it seemed that kindness and pity followed involuntarily.
"I choose to overlook what you did because you are not wholly accountable, and because there must be no trouble between Alfred and you. May I rely on you to keep the silence and seal the lips of that priest? And you know there was a man killed or injured last night. I want to forget that dreadful thing. I don't want it known that I had heard."
"The greaser didn't die," interrupted Stewart.
"Ah, that's not so bad after all. I'm glad for the sake of your friend, that little Mexican girl."
A slow scarlet wave overspread his face, and his shame was painful to see. That fixed in Madeline's mind a conviction that if he had been a heathen he was not wholly bad, and it made so much difference that she smiled down at him.
"You'll spare me further distress, will you not?"
His hoarse reply was incoherent, but she needed only to see his working face to know his remorse and gratitude. Madeline went back to her room, and presently Florence came for her, and directly they were sitting at breakfast. Madeline Hammond's impression of her brother's friend had to be reconstructed in a morning light. She felt the wholesome, frank, and sweet nature. She liked the slow, southern drawl, and she was puzzled to know whether Florence Kingsley was pretty, or striking, or unusual. She had a youthful glow and flush, the clear tan of outdoors, a face that lacked the soft curves and lines of Eastern women, and her eyes were light gray like crystals, steady, almost piercing, and her hair was a beautiful, bright, waving mass. Florence's sister was the elder of the two, a stout woman with a strong face and quiet eyes. It was a simple fare and service they gave to their guest, but they made no apologies for that. Indeed, Madeline felt their simplicity to be restful. She was tired with respect and sick of admiration, tired of adulation, and it was good to see that these Western women treated her as very likely as they would have treated any other visitor. They were sweet and kind, and what Madeline had at first thought was a lack of impression or vitality she soon discovered to be the natural reserve of women who did not live superficial lives. Florence was breezy and frank, her sister quiet and not given much to speak. Madeline thought she would like to have these women near her if she was ill or in trouble.
"Can you ride?"
Florence was asking.
That's what a Westerner always asks anyone from the East. "Can you ride like a man astride a horse, I mean?"
"That's fine. You look strong enough to hold a horse."
"We have some fine stock out here. I reckon when Al comes he'll go out to Bill Stewart's ranch. We'll have to go whether we want to or not, for when Bill learns you're here, he'll just pack us all off. You'll love old Bill. His ranch is run down, but the range and the rides up in the mountains, they're beautiful. We'll hunt and climb, and most of all we'll ride. I love a horse. I love the wind in my face and a wide stretch from the mountains beckoning. You must have the best horses on the range, and that means a scrap between Al and Bill and all the cowboys. We don't all agree about horses, except in case of Gene Stewart's Iron Grey."
"Does Mr. Stewart own the best horse in the country?" asked Madeline. Again she was filled with the thrill of remembering the long flight of Stewart's dark steed and rider.
"Yes, that's all he does own," replied Florence. "Gene can't even keep a quirt, but he sure does love that horse, and calls him—"
At this conjunction, a sharp knock on the parlor door interrupted the conversation. Florence's sister went to open it. She returned presently and said,
It's Gene. He's been dawdling out there on the front porch, and he knocked to let us know Miss Hammond's brother's coming."
Florence hurried into the parlor, followed by Madeline. The door stood open and disclosed Stuart sitting on the porch steps. From down the road came a clatter of hoofs, and Madeline looked over Florence's shoulder and saw a cloud of dust approaching, and in it she distinguished outlines of horses and riders. A warmth spread over her, a little tingle of gladness, and the feeling recalling her girlish love for her brother. What would he be like after these long years?
"Jean, has Jack kept his mouth shut?"
asked Florence, and again Madeline was aware of a sharp ring in the girl's voice. "No," replied Stuart.
"Jean, you won't have to let it come to a fight. Al can be managed, but Jack hates you and he'll have friends with him."
"There won't be any fight."
"Use your brains now,"
added Florence, and then she turned to push Madeline back into the parlor. Madeline's glow of warmth changed to a blank dismay. Was she to see her brother act with the violence she now associated with cowboys? The clatter of hoofs stopped before the door. Looking out, Madeline saw a bunch of dusty, wiry horses pawing the gravel and tossing their lean heads. Her swift glance ran over the lithe horseman, trying to pick out the one who was her brother, but she couldn't. Her glance, however, caught the same rough dress and hard aspect that characterized the cowboy Stuart. That one rider threw his bridle, leapt from the saddle, and came bounding up the porch steps. Florence met him at the door.
"Hello, Flo. Where is she?"
he called eagerly. With that, he looked over his shoulder and seen Madeline. He actually jumped to her. She hardly knew the tall form and the bronze face, but the warm flash of blue eyes was familiar. As for him, he had no doubt of his sister, it appeared, for with broken welcome he threw her arms around her and then held her off and looked searchingly at her. "Well, sister," he began, when Florence turned hurriedly from the door and interrupted him.
"Al, I think you better stop the wrangling out there."
He stared at her, appeared suddenly to hear the loud voices from the street, and then, releasing Madeline, he said, "By George, I forgot, Flo. There's a little business to see to. You keep my sister in here, please, and don't be fussing up now." He went out on the porch and called to his men. "Shut off your wind, Jack, and you too, Blaze. I don't want you fellows coming up here. But as you would come, you gotta shut up. This is my business." Hereupon he turned to Stuart, who was sitting on the fence. "Hello, Stuart." It was a greeting, but there was that in the voice which alarmed Madeline. Stuart leisurely got up and leisurely advanced to the porch. "Hello, Hammond," he drawled. "Drunk again last night, huh?" "Well, if you want to know if it's any of your mix, yes, I was pretty drunk," replied Stuart. It was kind of a cool speech that showed the cowboy in control of himself and the master of the situation. Not an easy speech to follow up with undue inquisitiveness. There was a short silence. "Damn it, Stuart," said the speaker presently. "Here's the situation. It's all over town that you met my sister last night at the station and insulted her. Jack's got in for you, and so have these other boys, but it's my affair. Understand I didn't fetch them here. They can see you square yourself, or else, Gene, you've been on the wrong trail for some time, drinking and all that. You're gonna go to the bad, but Bill thinks and I think you're still a man yet. We don't know where you lie. Now what do you got to say for yourself?" "Nobody's insinuating I'm a liar," drawled Stuart. "Nope. Well, I'm glad to hear that. You see, Al, I was pretty drunk last night, but not drunk enough to forget the least thing I did. I told Pat Haas so this morning when he was curious, and that's polite for me to be to Pat. Well, I found Miss Hammond waiting alone in the station. She was wearing a veil, but I knew she was a lady, of course. I imagine now that I think upon it that Miss Hammond found my actions rather startling. At this point, Madeline answered to an unconscious impulse, eluded Florence, and walked out upon the porch. Sombreros flashed down, and the lean horses jumped.
"Gentlemen,"
said Madeline rather breathlessly, and it was not to add to her calmness to feel a hot flush in her cheeks.
"I'm very new in Western ways, but I think you're laboring upon a mistake, which in justice to Mr. Stewart I want to correct. Indeed, he was rather abrupt and strange when he came to me last night, but as I understand him now, I can attribute that to his gallantry. He was somewhat wild and sudden and sentimental in his demand to protect me, and it was not clear whether he meant his protection for last night or forever, but I am happy to say he offered me no word that was not honorable, and he saw me safely here to Miss Kingsley's home."
End of chapter 2.